It's troubleshooting Windows failover clustering. Going to run through some things, give some refreshers, run through some actual scenarios. Some stuff is broken. Where do you fix it? How do you fix it? And then actually fix it. So, this is our agenda for today. First thing we're going to talk about is cluster validation. We're going to talk about, the what, the why, the where to look. If I have this failure, this is where I should be looking at, why I should be looking at it, how I can look at it. Go over some scenarios. Everybody's had that call at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, where a cluster name object is deleted. A virtual name is deleted. So we're going to go over recovering that. Okay? Show you some new features about AD in the process. Hyper-V clusters are really starting to be big now. Okay? Especially with the use of CSV. CSV can have some problems. So we're going to go over those as well, some of the troubleshooting for that. And then we'll touch on some other troubleshooting things that you may see from a cluster standpoint. And then just wrap it up. So the first thing is cluster validation. Anytime we talk about cluster validation, we're going to talk about the support policy. Here's the article on it. Here's the TechNet article. All individual components must be logo certified for 2008 or 2008 R2. Okay? Previous version, 2003, the entire solution had to be certified. Now it's just individual components have to be certified. The other option, or the other thing about it, is that you must pass a full validation with all those components. Now, with validation, there's errors and there's warnings. Warnings just simply mean you're out of best practice. You'll still most likely be fine. You're still supported. It's just, there's nothing, you just have to, it's something that you should look at. And I'll show some stuff on it too. Cluster Validate is built into the product. Something new for R2 is you could, once you're connected to the cluster, just click on Validate this cluster. You don't have to add the nodes, they'll add in automatically. Warns you if best practices aren't there. Test the collection of the servers as a whole to make sure that it's done. You always want to make sure you run Validate before you create the cluster. One of the things it's going to show you is if there is a problem, then you'll know it before you even start with clustering. Okay? Which is always a good thing to know. Anytime you start, your cluster is up and running, you have, you're adding another node, you're adding another disk, you're adding a network card, updating MPIO, anything like that. We want you to also run Validate to test those individual components. The blog down at the bottom of the slide, or the TechNet article I should say, actually goes through, if you add a node, just run this test. If you add a network card, just run this test. Okay? So we don't require a full validation to be run all the time. Adding a node, yes, full validation. Okay, some of the new tests in R2 as far as validation is the cluster configuration. We are actually going to start looking at the resources. How are the resources configured? How are the groups configured? Do we have dependencies set properly? Okay, we're going to look at your quorum configuration. Are you on the best quorum model based on the number of nodes that you have? Okay, look at the resource status. We'll actually check the service principal name to make sure that it's correct out in AD as well. Some of the networking stuff, we're actually looking at the network binding order. Not the cluster network order, but the actual Windows binding order in case you need to change it. If you're on a multi-site cluster with multiple subnets, we'll check that as well. Some of the consistent configuration, basically, is the cluster server service set correctly? Is the cluster disk set correctly? So here, I have an example validation report with just these things. So the cluster configuration shows a warning. That's a warning, not a failure. Okay? So if I go and look at it, I've got a couple of things that are set. So if I look at cluster volumes as an example, I'll see here that my value for disk run check disk, should check disk run when I'm brought online, has been changed from the default value. 0 is default, which is check to see if the dirty bit's set, run check disk if there's corruption. Right now it's set to 4, which is do not run check disk. Okay? This is something that you may want to consider doing for, a multi-terabyte drive with, terabytes of data. Check disk is going to take forever to run. Okay? You want to be able to schedule the check disk to run. So this is just, hey, you're not at the default level. That's fine. Okay? If I look at the quorum configuration, I'm on 2 nodes. Quorum model is all based off the voting system, as you've probably heard from some of the other sessions. We want an odd number of votes. Okay? Right now, I am set, as it shows here, as a node majority. I only have 2 votes. Okay? 1 vote goes down, I got 1 vote left. 1 is not a majority, it is a half. Cluster service stops. So you have to manually interact to get it going again. Okay? So the recommended core configuration in this one is node and disk. If we had no disks in the cluster, that would actually say the recommended is node and file share witness. Okay? So you get your odd number of votes. Lastly, the resource status lists all the different resources here. And I've got this file server 1 that does not have all the nodes as a possible owner. Okay? I don't want this group to fail over to this other node, so in that case, that's fine. But if you didn't know it, then you'd want to know it. So go look at it. Validating the storage. We will check any disk that is not already in a group and online. Disks in available storage, we're going to check. Disks that are offline, we're going to check. Disks that are not yet in the cluster, we're going to check. If they're not in the cluster, we're going to check to see if they're clusterable. Now, when we say they're clusterable, we're going to check to see 2008 R2, no service pack. We're going to check to see if all nodes have access to that disk. If it is, we'll check it. Service Pack 1 with a hotfix is we will check to see if at least 2 machines have access to a drive. So if I've got a 6-node cluster spread out between 3 nodes here, 3 nodes at this other site, I've got my SAN here, my SAN here. As long as these 3 machines, or at least 2, can access the drive, we're going to check it. Okay? We do have the option on a working cluster, as you can see here, we will look to see what groups are there and what's online. Okay? So we're going to default say, leave this application alone. So you can run it during production hours. Okay? Not affect my file server group, my SQL server group. It'll just check all the other drives. Okay? So we have that safeguard in there. We do have the option there. We can take the groups offline if you select it, but you have to select it. It's not the default. So, of course, that's downtime. You'd want to schedule that one off. For later, I should say. Okay, some of the tips, and after I go through a lot of this stuff, I'm going to have a lot of tips as we go along. So, for validate, any clustered shared volumes, you must manually take them offline for us to check it. Okay? If you take it offline, any VMs that are on that drive also going to have to come offline. So, again, we're out of production, so you may have to schedule it. We can run it anytime, like I said. All the validation reports are in the Windows Cluster Reports folder. A lot of our reporting stuff for clusters is in that reports folder now. You can run it as many times as you want. As part of the file names, we are actually time and date stamping them. We don't append to the log, we just continually create new ones. Running it on a single node is not going to give you a lot. We're going to skip all the networking tests. We're going to skip all the storage tests. Okay? So there's not really a lot. You would do that if you wanted to check like the cluster configuration. You can see how the groups and such are configured. It has a little picture representation of your dependencies. It'll show you all the resources. It'll show you all the parameters of it. Maybe you want it as like a backup copy that you just kind of file away in case you have to recreate the resources again. These are the settings for it. This is how the group is configured and so forth. Okay? We have a PowerShell. Most all the commands I'm going to be doing in this one is PowerShell. Okay? So test-cluster is our little PowerShell commandlet to run it. Use it as a troubleshooting tool. Can't stress that enough. If you've got a networking issue, run the networking test. Is there latency? Is there no connectivity? Okay? We can help check that. Even some of our Microsoft engineers forget that it's there. So it's not just to be run when you create the cluster. You can run it at any time. Now, let's go on to the what, the why, and where to look. Some of this is going to be a little bit of a refresher from the other ones, but I just want to kind of drive the point home. Get to know the PowerShell. Okay? Cluster.exe is no longer being updated. It's still there, but you can't do as much as you can with PowerShell. Okay? Not everybody's familiar with PowerShell. That's me. I'm one of them. Okay? But there's online help that you can do. I've got a couple of text files here. If you just do, let me make that a little bigger. So you can see it better. From the PowerShell command, get-help, *cluster*. Okay? Show me all commandlets that have the word cluster in it. Okay? It also gives you a brief description of it, of what it is. To go a little further, if you were to type get-help space a commandlet, new -cluster in this case, -examples, it will give you example commands that you can start using. In this case, first example, I'm creating a new cluster. This is the name. These are the nodes. In this case, I've got DHCP. So run that command, fully functioning cluster. All disks are there. Cluster is configured. Okay? A lot of people really like the scripting and stuff. We've kind of jumped on board with PowerShell. So get to know it. It may go away someday. The other thing with PowerShell is now you can configure read-only access to the cluster for users. Meaning, I have a user, let's say our program manager here, that I want him to be able to look at my cluster, but not touch it. He can load up failover management, he can connect, and he can just go through the screens. That's it. He can't touch anything. He can't move a group. He can't look at anything. He can't delete anything, create anything. It's very specifically read-only, like it says. Some of our events were still errors, critical warnings, and so forth, still going to be in the system event log. All our informational events now is in an operational channel, which I'll show you here in just a second. Informational events, I've taken the group offline, taken the resource offline. I brought it online. That's stuff that would be in the informational. Okay, here's our operational channel where it's at. It's in Event Viewer, Applications and Services, Microsoft, Windows, Failover Clustering. Okay, this is where you can see some of it. An example here, I brought this application online. Okay, so if you've got any monitoring software where you want to start monitoring for stuff like that, it's no longer in the system event log. Okay, so you need to change up your monitoring. We have new diagnostic logging now. This is where you start getting into some of the debugging and stuff. This one I'm not really going to cover in this particular session. But, you know, in Event Viewer, you have to click the View menu, Show Analytic and Debug Logs, you can see it. The diagnostic logging is disabled as a default. Okay, so you just right-click Enable Log and you got it. Now once you start increasing your log levels to get some of the deeper debugging stuff or, you know, diagnostic stuff, it'll start getting logged here. And you can actually see them. To see them, once you enable the diagnostic logging, you cannot see real-time what it is. Okay? You have to actually go disable it to start seeing the events that'll show up. Okay? The cluster logs now part of this ETW channels, the tracing is what we're doing. Looking at some of the normal cluster events, you would see we do have every event that cluster can put out. We've got it online off the TechNet site. We'll give you a description of it. We'll give you some of the most common reasons for why it would do it. This particular instance, at event turned 1038, I lost access to my drive. Okay, go check your storage configuration. That's going to be the first thing. We have events that we can look at from a cluster-wide perspective. In the demos, I actually kind of show it what it is. But on the initial screen of failover management, we've got cluster events. We will have the number of events in the last 24 hours regarding anything about the cluster. Okay, whether a resource failed, group failed, you know, anything of that nature from any node. It just all combines it. Okay, and again, I'll show you. You know, here I've only got 2 errors, so it brings up the dialog box showing those events. We have built-in queries now, and you know, I'll show you. This will be part of the demo. We've got application level and resource level. Application level being the group. Okay, once you're highlighted on that group, then any resource that is errored in that group, it's going to show up in that dialog box. We can also get more specific, highlight a specific resource, just show those resource errors. You know, I don't care about all the other stuff, just those. Again, this is going to be the entire system event log. So if your event log goes back a year, you're going to see the events from a year ago. So some of the tips on it: if you encounter a problem, start with the cluster events. Okay? Look at the cluster wide. See if there's multiple errors. You know, if it's just one disk, we could look at just the one disk. If it's multiple disks and you didn't know, then we could be looking at something else. Okay? Look at the system event logs. Look for anything that started right before we showed the cluster events. Okay? Check the application event log if it's an application, SQL, Oracle, you know, Exchange, whatever it is. Don't get distracted by the symptoms. If a disk fails, don't focus on the disk. Step back, take a look at it. Are there any other events? Do I have a controller that failed? You know, look at it from that perspective. If we don't, then we can start narrowing it down. But start generic and work down. That way you don't get, sometimes you can get to where you're going down a wrong path if you focus on that first. So let's step back and take a look. The debugging logging, here's our traces, the trace sessions. The logging is done per reboot. Okay, and I'll show you that in just a second. But it's not the starting and stopping of the cluster service like the old cluster log was. You reboot the machine, it comes up, we're writing to this trace file. Once you reboot the machine, we're going to work on another one. Here's some of the logging levels. Default is 3. Errors, warnings, and infos. This is what's going to be captured in the trace session. What you can do to generate a cluster log, that's what it's going to show. If you set the level to 5 debugging, it can show performance issues with the machine. Now, how much? I couldn't say. You got a SQL cluster. SQL's running at 60% CPU. You enable the debug logging level 5. It's not going to jump it to like 90% CPU. It's not that drastic. Okay. So this is how it works. We've got our ETL file, lasts for the uptime of the node, like I said. Okay. Every time you reboot the machine, we will go to a different ETL. Start logging there. The original one will be left. Okay. So here's our 3 ETL files. 1, 2, and 3. So right now we're working off of 1. Okay. So we're just writing to that, writing to that, writing to that. Once it fills up, it just starts throwing out the old stuff, and it's just wrapping inside itself. So we reboot the machine, leave 1 intact, leave whatever's in there, start logging to 2. Start doing it. It starts logging and wrapping and so forth. Same thing to 3, reboot again. We'll go back to 1. Now 1's already got data in it. It's all thrown out. Get rid of it. We don't need it. Okay? Now, each of the log files are 100 meg as a default. You can increase it, you can decrease it. Okay? When generating a cluster log off those sizes, if you've got an ETL file that's say 90 meg, for example, the cluster log when you generate it is not going to be 90 meg as well. There's a lot of binary information in those. There's a lot of white spaces and stuff that get thrown out, so it'll be considerably less when you combine them together. Git-cluster log is the command. Same thing as cluster space log space / generate. Same thing. That's the PowerShell. It's confusing sometimes. If the machine was booted February 1st. Okay? You reboot the machine every 1st. The 1st of every month. Okay? I'm writing to 001. About February 4th, all the other stuff starting to get thrown out because we're starting to wrap inside the log. Okay? I reboot the machine on March 1st. 1's left intact, now I start writing to 2. It starts going, and so forth. There's a problem, I need to generate a cluster log. When it combines all the logs together, you're going to see just what's in the ETLs. So you'll see an ending of February 28th, and then the second log is already wrapped. So you'll jump from February 28th to March 15th. We lost a couple of weeks. Okay, don't get confused by that. Okay, if you start getting that and you're not getting all the data that you want, increase the size. So some of the tips on it, it can be verbose, it can be complex, especially when you first start looking at it. Once you start getting the hang of what it is, you'll figure out there's a lot of stuff you can ignore and you know exactly where to go. But it shouldn't be the first place you go to. Look at all the events first. Make sure that you're capturing 72 hours worth of data. Generate a log and look to see, how many days is it? If it's only getting 1 day, we may want to increase the log size. All the timestamps are still in GMT. Okay, so if you're looking at the cluster log trying to match it up with the event log, the time is not going to be the same. Figure in your GMT. -6 if you're in Central, -5 if you're in Eastern. One of the things that I always do, I try and generate the error if I can. Make it fresh. Generate a cluster log, go to the bottom, search up. You can search on bracket ERR bracket, or what I always look at, -- greater than failed, no spaces. That's the line that actually changes from either online pending to failed in failover management. Okay? Once you get there, scroll up a little bit and you can see where the actual errors are. And I'll show that in one of the demos. We have a lot of status codes in the cluster log. So net help message from a command prompt will give you a description of what it is. You know, it could be, you know, this one 5018, which is I can't bring it on. You know, 1131, not enough server storage, and so forth. So you can start kind of looking at that. Okay, now some of the break me stuff. Cluster name, objects, virtual objects. We are integrated with AD, so we create objects. So I come in, I get my email. We're in the process of doing monthly scrubbing of Active Directory objects. While doing this, one of the guys inadvertently deleted the names. We tried creating them, but it didn't work. Help. Okay? So, a couple of things we have to know first, or that's good to know, for one of them, is if you get the properties of the resource, two things you want to look at. What's the DC? What's the object GUID? Okay? Whenever we create the object, we note where we created it, what DC. Anytime we're bringing it online, we're going to that DC first. If we don't find it there, then we'll start, you know, searching the other DCs. So, because of, you know, you've got replication that has to take place. So if you go to some other DC, then you have to wait for the replication. You know, maybe the replication isn't every 10 minutes. Maybe you can't force a replication right now. So go to it. The other thing is the object GUID. It's not like 2003 where all we care about is that name there. We're actually accessing it by the GUID that Active Directory has. Okay? So, let's go ahead and go through this. I have my cluster here. My cluster name, lost-CNO. If I try and bring it online, it fails to come online. It just goes offline. Now, they had said they tried to recreate it, so if I look at my DC, I see they must have deleted it already because it didn't work. Let me refresh just to make sure. No, it's not there. Now, what I need to do is I go back to my node because I want to get what's my creating DC, what's my object GUID. So I go with get-cluster resource, the resource name, which is my cluster name. Ensure that you put it in quotes. Anything with a space, make sure you put in quotes. Me personally, I get in the habit, any resource, whether there's a space or not, I put it in quotes. Okay? Whatever the up and down thing is, pipe or whatever. Get-cluster parameter, and then the exact parameters I want. I want creating DC and object GUID. Yep. Okay, so it shows me. Here's my DC, here's my object GUID. Now, the thing about the object GUID is it's showing here the friendly name. No, I'm sorry. It is showing the hexadecimal value that AD has. AD's kind of funny with the way it does the numbers. But what it does is, you know, it's a long string of numbers. The first 4 pairs of numbers takes that, reverses them. Next 2 pairs reverses them. Next 2 reverse them. The last leave it as is. So in this case here, I look at my first 4 pairs of numbers. What I'm going to be looking for is 7A 3094A6. Okay, so that's what I'm going to look for to restore it. So I go back to my DC. Now, one quick note, 2008 R2 functional level DCs, you can enable a recycle bin. Okay, it's actually pretty sweet once I found out about it and started playing around with it. Restoring an AD object without the recycle bin, for cluster anyway, it doesn't contain everything. You know, there's some extra stuff we've got to do with cluster. We've got to go hijack it. We've got to set a new password. We have to make sure it's disabled. You know, things along that nature. So if I run PowerShell, and I'm going to cheat, because it kind of gets a little long, depending on what you're filtering for. But the command get-AD object, and then I want to filter. Is deleted equal true, so only look in the recycle bin. And the SAM account name is equal to lost-CNO, which lost-CNO, include any deleted items that you see. And I want to format it, just show me the three things that I really want. The SAM account name, the last known parent, which is the OU that it was at, and the object GUID. Here I've got 5 of them. Now, remember we did, AD does this funky thing with the numbers. We want to look for the one that starts 7A. Here it is right here, 7A3094A6. Okay, that's the one we want to restore. So the command to restore it is a lot easier. It's just restore-AD object -identity and then the GUID. Restore. So if I go back to my AD users and computers, refresh this, here's my lost CNO. The thing about the AD recycle bin versus something like AD restore, for example, AD restore you can put it in default computers OU. Okay? The recycle bin will actually put it back where it was. Okay? That's the last known parent. It also will keep all the security permissions that had on that object. If it's within the, what is it? Where it recycles the computer passwords in AD, if it's restored within that time period, what is it, like 30 days I think is what it is. If it's restored within that time period, which generally it's going to be, you're going to know about it pretty quick. It will keep that password so you don't have to hijack anything. Okay? And it brings it on, it's enabled. So if I go back to my cluster, I can just bring it online. Done. I didn't have to do any of the extra stuff. Okay? Now, if we wanted to look at this, let's see, which node am I on? Node 1. I was talking about the looking at the cluster log. If I just do a get-cluster log, generates the cluster logs everywhere. It's in the Windows cluster reports folder, cluster.log. And I just made it bigger so easier to see. Scroll down to the very bottom. Do a find, -- greater than failed. Search up. Here's where it actually failed. So now I just have to scroll up a little bit to see why it failed. which is sometimes you have to scroll up a little bit. I can't find it, so I'll cheat. Because my virtual machine, or my virtual computer object has also been deleted. Okay? So what it's doing is it's going to go try and find the account using the GUID. Okay? Not the name. Go to the DC, get the GUID. Okay? Try and validate the attributes of it. It can't find it. Actually, this one's yeah, this one was successful. So where is it? Where is it? Where is it? But it'll say that it can't be found, is what it is. If I was to look at the cluster, the events, you know, highlight the resource, show critical events, here's the dialog box that pops up. In essence, what it's doing is popping down to the bottom. So it's show me all events for this resource. Okay? I've got the 1069 generic, hey, it failed. Well, I already know that. And then my 1207 event, which is, you know, the computer unable to get computer object using the GUID. Okay? Specified domain does not exist or could not be contacted. Oh, that's nice. Okay? It can't find it. Okay? If I look at the, if I just go and look at the event log, in my system event, for my 1207, if I bring it up, you know, here's the same event. Now, down at the bottom, you've got the link there, Event Log Online Help. Okay? If you're not sure about it, just click on it. What it's going to do is it's basically, this is the product name, this is the version, this is the ID, and this is the source. So it's going to go out to TechNet or MSDN, I forget which one it is, and actually do a search of it and get to those pages where it displays all of our different event IDs, and it actually goes to that very specific event ID. Okay? So as long as it's got internet access, click on it. Here's a description. Here's some of the general causes for it. This is how you resolve it. Okay? So if you're not sure, go that route. Okay? Now, my virtual computer object is also failed. Okay? I can do the same thing for it. Okay? Which I've kind of been doing this and I don't want to do it, but it's the same exact process. The other thing about it is, you know, like I said, the permissions to the object are still kept intact. So in 2008 R2 clusters, we have to have, our cluster name object has to have rights to that. It keeps it with the recycle bin. If you use something like AD restore to do it, you've got to go manually add that in. Can't forget. Okay? So, if you have a chance, enable recycle bin if you can, because it's actually really nice. There's a lot of neat things you can do with it. So we switch back over here. So, some of the troubleshooting tips on it. First thing, if they're accidentally deleting it, go check the box under the properties of that object in AD. Prevent them from accidentally deleting it. Number one thing. Whenever cluster creates objects in AD, we don't check that box as the default. So you may want to go and check and do it. Okay? If you have to repair the object, know what the creating DC is, go there. Decipher the GUID. Again, first 4 pairs of numbers, 8. Last 2, got 2, 2, 2, and 2. Actually, This 2 is here, this 2 is here, this 2 is here, that 2 is here. Okay? Just to kind of show you what I mean, if I look at my DC, if I just bring up the properties of this, go to my attributes for object GUID, you'll notice here, I guess the friendlier name, 7A, is what it starts with. Hexadecimal is it's the fourth pair. Okay, so that's the funky stuff AD does. So know which object you're supposed to be getting. Okay. Ensure domain replication takes place. Once you restore it, forced replication if you have to. If you can't, as long as it's restored on that DC that we created it on, then we're good. Bring it online. Let the replication take place whenever it takes place. Okay? If you don't have a recycle bin enabled, in order to use something like AD Restore and then repair the object within failover management, the user logged on must have reset passwords right in AD, because we are going to go hijack it. Okay? So we have to have the right to do it. Here's a blog that lists, Chuck Timmon, one of our other senior engineers, had written. It goes through the process of using AD Restore. Okay? And he really maps out, deciphering the GUID as well. If you have the AD Recycle bin, here's this blog. Goes through the exact steps that I went to. In fact, it uses the exact same GUID numbers, actually. Yes? Say that again, I'm sorry. Okay, the question was, what happens if your creating DC is offline? The answer is, doesn't matter. We're going to go to that DC. If we can't find it, then we will just do a query for all DCs. Okay? So if it's offline, we'll go search the other DCs. So once you go and repair the object, then you want to ensure that you force the replication so that all DCs will come up. Because once we go to bring the name online, we're just going to do a query, go to that DC, it's not there. Okay, hey, some DC answer me. I don't care who. Somebody answer me, tell me it's there. Okay? It'll eventually get to the right DC. So that's why you want to force replication if you're not on that creating DC. Okay? Now, some of the other tips, like I said, here's the article on understanding, implementing best practices and stuff, the recycle bin. It's a pretty long article. Goes through everything. Extending your schema if it's not there. Adding your DC in. All the different commands you can do. Okay? The command I used kind of went, I want to search very specifically. So, he actually shows if you didn't specify you only want these parameters, then it's going to show you every attribute of it. Okay, yes? R2. Has to be at R2, not 2008. 47, if you're that deep into AD. 44, which is 2008, that's not going to get it. Okay? Okay, so now let's go into the CSV troubleshooting. Got a couple of things here. So, this is my 1 a.m. call. They were doing some IP address changes. I'm on iSCSI, so that's why it's affected me. They did some IP address changes, reset up the iSCSI targets and so forth. They had a problem they can't figure out. The changes went fine. CSV drives are in redirected access mode, but the VMs are still running fine. Okay? So, what we have to look at here is this is what it looks like. Okay? I've got my SAN, my VHD is running off the SAN, clustered shared volume, and the VM is running on node 2. Okay? I lose my connectivity from node 2. So what's going to happen is we're going to start redirecting I/O, anything that needs to get written to that drive, over the network to the other node that actually has it. So it'll look like this. So now instead of a down, it's having to go around. Now, performance can get impacted on that VM because we're no longer directly writing to the local VHD. We're having to go over the network. Okay? So there may be a little performance impact to it. You know, one of our PMs always says, think of it as running, when you have a flat tire but it doesn't go all the way. You can't go 100 miles an hour with it. Just get to a gas station. It'll still be going. Once you get to that gas station, you can then you can fix it. Okay? Here's what it's going to look like. Online redirected access. Basically, one or more nodes have lost connection to the SAN. A backup application like the CSV aware, like DPM, Net Backup has one. I think there's a couple others. I think UltraBack, I think, is one of the other ones that have it. It'll actually put it online backup in progress, redirected access. So you'll know there's a backup that had happened. Or someone just manually put it in redirected access mode. So let's go ahead and look at this first thing with redirected access mode. All right, cancel this. And close that one. Okay, so here it is. I've got 2 drives that are redirected access mode. Okay, now, if you look at the names of them, I've got 2 that are supposed to run on node 3. I've got 2 that are supposed to be run on node 4. Okay, just by the names. The ones that are supposed to be running on 4 are in redirected access mode, even though the owner is node 3. For some reason, it can't get access to them. Okay, so first thing I can do is I just highlight it, and then I can show critical events for this resource. Here's all my events, okay, which there's a whole slew of them. If I look at it, let me do this, make it easier to see. Okay. Oops. Stay. Okay. The description there, cluster shared volume, CSV2 on node 4, no longer directly accessible from this node. I/O will be redirected to the storage device over the network to a node that owns it. Node 3 owns it, so we're having to go over the network. Okay? So, why isn't it redirected? Or why is it redirecting? So, I go through here and I start to see other errors, such as, actually let me get closer to when the problem occurred. Here we go. Yep, I was in the right spot. Okay. I have an event 1038. ownership of the disk unexpectedly lost by the node. Okay? For some reason, we lost access to it. We have our 1069 generic and our event 1034. We still access everything knowing it by its disk signature. Okay? Says the disk signature could not be found. Okay? So, I go to node 4. Those are the only real errors that I had. So let me go to the event log. Refresh it. Here's that same 5121 error. So if I start scrolling through to get to the beginning of it, taking my step back, here's where it starts. Again, I'm on iSCSI. So I've got a source, iSCSI PRT. I lost connection to the target. So I'm going to retry. And then the next one, the retry failed. Okay, so now, okay, I've got some sort of problem with my target. Okay, I could go to, which I'm not going to because it's just going to delay. If I go and look at my initiator, I see it's inactive. Okay, I lost target. So I try and connect on it. I'm not going to because it's gonna take a while to get to it. So, but it still fails. Okay, so now I've got to go and look at my actual target. Is there a problem on my target? So I go out here, look at my target. This is my target here. Look at the properties of it. Here's my initiators. When they changed the IP address, they didn't add the node in. Is what this problem turned out to be. So in this case, it was a storage configuration issue. So let me go and add it. 192. 168. 10. So I go and add it. Now I can go back to my initiator and connect. This time it does connect. Okay? So I go out to back to failover management, see if I can now take it. If I right click on the CSV drive, more actions, this is where I can turn off redirected access. I can turn it on. Okay, so I turn it off to see if it's fixed, which in this case it does. Okay, now I can move it back to the node that it belongs to. Okay, so that's one that was actually a storage issue. Okay, now I have another one. This 3 a.m. now, and I'm contemplating firing my network admins because they're screwing everything up. Jeff completed network card driver, firmware updates, and the IP addresses changed. But when we seem to be having problems accessing the CSV drives. When attempting to access them, Explorer hangs. He's new to R2 failover clusters. So, let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let me get rid of this one. Get rid of this one. So here's my two nodes. So, CSV, we sudo reparse point. All CSV goes into the C cluster storage folder. Okay? Now, I see what they see. It's hanging. Okay? Do I have a storage problem? Do I have some other problem? So I go and look in failover management. I go look at the storage. All the storage shows is online. Okay, so it's not a problem of redirected access. Okay, now remember, we have to have, well, so let me do this. Let me highlight this first one. Let me try show critical events. Get it just right. Okay, no events for this specific resource. So I can't get anything from here. If I go up here to the name of the cluster, here's my recent cluster events. So I've had, 366. Let me go look at that, which brings up these. Okay, all of them are 5120. Description, the cluster shared volume. Can everybody see that? The cluster shared volume is no longer available on this node because of status bad network path. All I/O will be temporarily queued until it's reestablished. In other words, what it's saying is I can't get over the network to the other node that currently owns it. Okay? Anytime we open up the cluster storage folder and try and access the drives, we're going to try and go over the network if we're not the coordinator. Okay? Because anytime you're doing that, you're looking at metadata rights, which metadata rights are only available from the node that owns it. Okay? So now, okay, I've got some sort of a network type issue I'm looking for. So what I need to do now is I found that with cluster. Let me search. I've searched the event log, system event log, and there's nothing there as well. Okay, because it's a long string and I don't want to waste time doing it. But there's nothing in the event log. So now I got to look at, okay, there's a problem. There's something with my CSV network that's going on. So one of the things you want to try and do is, if I look first in failover management at my networks, I see that my CSV network, it's up. Okay? So it's not a problem with connectivity, cable pulled, our heartbeats, over port 3343, they're not getting through. Everything looks good. So it's like, okay, now, what are the other things that can cause it? NTLM being disabled, SMB connectivity, and so forth. So I am on node 6. So if I just run a command prompt, if I go with a net view, and then you want to use the IP address, so it's 172.16. What is it? 0.11. Can I just do a net view of it? Can I make my SMB connection? Here it says no. Okay, so, is it something with this network? Is it something with all the networks? So let me try another one of the other networks, 192.168.68.0.11. No entries in the list. So it was successful going through that. Okay, so as a network person, I know, okay, there's no SMB connectivity. Okay. So if I go look at the properties of the cards, Look at my CSV network. Here's my problem. File and print sharing, client from Microsoft has been disabled. Okay? We have to have that for SMB connectivity. 2003 days with cluster, the recommendation was disable that. Okay? 2008, everything has changed. Leave it enabled. It will break your CSV. Okay? So if I go ahead and re-enable it, I go over to my other node and check it. Since Jeff decided to do this one too. Public's good. Okay, it's disabled here, so let me do it as well. Go ahead and check my iSCSI. It's there. So now I've got my connectivity back. So if I look at my node now, Explorer, let's just go to 5. There's my folders. There's my drives, actually. Okay? So don't disable file and print sharing. Don't disable client from Microsoft. SMB connectivity is how we're connecting over. So, for the tips for it, check the system event log for any network connectivity or AD access problems. Okay? In this case, for this very specific thing, there wasn't any. Okay? It's just simple, file and print sharing was disabled. Verify that your server and workstation services are started. Okay? I just did a net view to one of the other networks and it worked. So I know it's not server or workstation. Okay? Verify all the cluster networks are configured to support SMB. This is the article for the 2003 clusters. Disable that functionality. It will break us. Okay? Perform file copies. If you can get a connection, perform a file copy. See if there's a problem with the network. Are we dropping a lot of packets? Is the network oversaturated? Things of that nature. So, the key thing when troubleshooting a CSV storage problem, don't always think of it as a storage problem. It could be a network problem. Okay? If NTLM is disabled, you get that same similar behavior. Okay? We use NTLM for our authentication for our SMB connection. Okay? Have to be able to get to a domain controller for that as well. Don't make assumptions that it's immediately a storage problem. Part of the time it's not. Okay, now for some of the other stuff, I'm just going to kind of touch base on some of the more common things that we've seen. RHS terminations. We keep all resources in a resource host system, RHS. Okay? If it's online, is it online? Is it offline? If it's online, we want to do our is alive checks, our looks alive checks, and so forth. That's all going through the resource host system. If a particular resource is not responding, then we will consider it as deadlocked and we will terminate the RHS, the host system for it. Okay? Anything else, any other resource that's in that same RHS is also going to get terminated. It's going to show as failed. Okay? Default, when you create the cluster, everything on one node, it's a per node thing. Everything that is on that node is in that one RHS process. So if I've got some, misbehaving application that terminates RHS, everything's going to fail. And then we'll bring it all back online. But we will identify it we've got two events. One is 1230. We actually identify what's the resource name, what's the resource DLL that it uses. Okay? So one, you'll know that, okay, it's this resource. Is it a backup agent? Is it an IP address? Is it, SQL? Once we know that it's terminated, we consider it as a misbehaving, So we will check, there's a checkbox it'll do to put that one resource in its own resource monitor. So that if it fails again, then you fail again. Everything else is not going to get affected by it. Okay? And then the generic at 1146, RHS stopped unexpectedly. Okay? So what we have to look at is, it terminated because the resource didn't respond to the call. Okay? Here's an article that lists, these are the things that we do, the cluster-specific ones. Okay? Third-party stuff, we couldn't tell you what it is. It'd be their own types of checks. But look for any underlying failures. Again, don't point at cluster as being the problem. If it's a storage, if it's a particular disk that's failing, look for any other storage type events. Did we lose connectivity to it? Maybe run a performance monitor on it to see if maybe it's just latency. Okay, there's a couple of blogs here that talk about RHS and some of the terminations. User mode problems. We have user mode health checking that we do between our kernel mode component and the user mode component. Okay, if we determine that user mode is hung, we will bug check the box. Okay, so that we've got a memory dump if it's set to create kernel dump, complete dump, whatever it's set for, so that it can be diagnosed at a later time to see what's hanging up. It'll show in the dump that cluster created the bug check, but cluster wasn't the problem. It was something else. Okay, so you have to start using general hanging debugging if you get into debugging. Do we have exclusive locks? Do we have anything that's blocking other threads? Those type things. Okay, there's two different settings that control this. Plus SVC hang timeout. This is the amount of time in seconds that we're going to wait. 60 seconds is the default. You don't respond in 60 seconds, we're gonna blow the whole thing up. Okay? The other thing is the hang recovery action. If we detect a deadlock, what do? Default, bug check the box. You can change this to 0, disable it altogether. If you do that, if it hangs, it hangs. We'll have it just log an event if you want it to set to 1. So you can see if it's a lot of times or any particular time doesn't affect production unless the box totally hangs. We can set it to 2 to terminate the service if you want. If you terminate the service, we'll do our best to get it over there, but if user mode is hung, then we may or may not be successful at it. Okay? It's not a problem from cluster. Okay? If there's a memory dump, start looking at it. Okay? Look for any types of hangs, locks, handles, anything with excessive handles. Here's a blog that you can access that actually gives a better, a lot better description, including what to look for. We are dependent on WMI for a lot of our stuff. Okay? So if WMI is having a problem, we're going to have a problem. Failover management itself is a WMI application. Okay? So make sure the services are running. Do a get-WMI object through PowerShell. Basically, it's just going to, that command there is just going to list out the resources. You can use webm test for the same thing. That's the output that you get there off to the side. All it's doing is just listing the resources. If you get an error, there's a problem with WMI. Okay, you may have to rebuild the repository for it. Maybe something hosed up by WMI. We've got new performance counters now in perfmon. You can look at all the different things here and monitor, if you really wanted to, how many API calls are being made. I mean, I don't get any use out of it. But one of the biggest things is the cluster shared volumes. That's one of the biggest things. You can monitor the traffic over the network or to the drives for those specific CSVs, if you wanted to. Are there latencies? Okay, so in summary, validate. Use it as a troubleshooting tool. Don't forget it's there. Okay? Use it for best practices if you can. We're relying on AD objects. Protect yourself. Make sure you check the box. Protect from accidental deletion. We don't do it as a default. Everything's headed in the PowerShell. Learn PowerShell. Again, get-help. Okay? That's true for any PowerShell thing, whether it be anything AD, iSCSI, networking, anything. Okay? Get-help, whatever, -examples. Gives you some examples. Okay? When troubleshooting, take a step back. Look at it as from the bigger picture before you focus your troubleshooting down. We're designed to detect, recover, and report problems. Don't shoot the messenger. Just because cluster is the source of it doesn't mean necessarily that we're the true cause. Okay? Here's just some of the breakouts. Here's some cluster resources, blogs, msdn.coms of program managers. If you download the PowerPoint, you'll see there's off TechNet, there's an Ask Core. That's where I'm at, where you can get a lot of this information, some of the other tracks. So, we have a couple of minutes for any questions that anyone may have.
Yeah, I've got one. What are the pros and are there any cons to having the AD recycle bin enabled, and why is it not the default setting if there are none?
You'd have to ask the directory services guy that, because I really don't know. Now, from a cluster perspective, I see it as a benefit because when I'm, if it wasn't enabled, okay, and I use AD restore, I run AD to restore, I restore it. It goes to default computers OU. I've got to move it over to that OU. I've got to go and bring up the properties of it, set all my settings for it. I have to go log on to my cluster as an account that has reset password rights. I've got to right click on the resource, choose repair AD object so we can go hijack it. Versus with AD recycle bin, restore it, bring it online. Done. So from a cluster perspective, that's the benefit that I would see of having it. Now, why it's not enabled, don't know. Anybody else? Yes?
You mentioned earlier in the presentation about creating a read-only view for cluster status for people who are not cluster admins.
Yes.
How exactly do you do this?
Okay, the question was, how do you set up read-only access for users? Basically, it's all command line or PowerShell. The commands I don't have right here with me. However, I will be at the cluster TLC booth from 3 to 5. If you come there, I'll show it to you. We can easily demo it. We've got a cluster running there. But it's just basically it's like 1 or 2 PowerShell commands. And set up, done. Now they can access it. But not do anything. So, anyone else?
You said that you needed SMB on all cluster networks. That includes the private?
The cluster network that is dedicated for CSV has to have it.
What about Heartbeat?
Heartbeat, you don't necessarily have to, but you probably want it to be, because if the CSV network is totally down, then we're going to try and move to some other network. Down meaning, it's not a valid network stack at all on either of the nodes or any of the nodes. So if it's like that, we're going to move to the next network in line. If it's the Heartbeat, that network's up, but we have our problem because there's no SMB. So we can't access anything on it. So general rule, leave it all as default. Okay, I'm out of time. All the ones that are left anyway. I appreciate you coming. Please fill out your surveys for ComNet and enjoy the rest of Tech Ed and the attendee party tonight.